Imagine wealth not as a number but as a quiet feeling in your chest. The sense that you can wake up tomorrow and largely choose how you spend your time. That feeling, more than any trophy, view, or balance sheet, is the real object of the chase. The Psychology of Money, by Morgan Housel, is a book about how people think, feel, and behave around money, and why those invisible patterns matter far more than spreadsheets. It refuses to be a manual of formulas. Instead, it is a conversation about luck and risk, about patience and pride, about the small emotions that have big financial consequences. What follows is a detailed, flowing summary of the book's central ideas, gathered into a single thread. Money is a story you tell yourself, and the quality of that story, humble, patient, skeptical, generous, largely determines the quality of your results. Housel begins by arguing that money decisions are rarely rational, in the strict textbook sense. They are reasonable, which is a kinder, more human standard. The rules you learned in class, maximize expected utility, optimize for highest mean return, may be mathematically correct, yet life is not lived on a chalkboard. We live inside bodies that remember fear, families that carry trauma, jobs that might evaporate, cultures that praise certain purchases. A person who grew up in inflation-ravaged times will save and invest differently than someone raised during a boom. Two people can act in opposite ways and both be reasonable, because their personal histories, what Housel calls our unique and turbulent experiences, define what risk feels like. This vantage point respects the reality that money is not just arithmetic, it is biography. From this foundation, he draws one of his signature contrasts. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are different skills. Getting wealthy often requires taking risks, being optimistic, and putting yourself out there. Staying wealthy requires humility, caution, and a protective room for error. Many investors master the first skill and fail at the second. The market itself is an environment where a handful of outlier days and years, what statisticians call tails, create most of the long-run returns. You can do everything right. And if you miss a small number of decisive periods, your results will look average or worse. Conversely, you can be mediocre most of the time, but present during a few great moments and your results will look brilliant. The lesson is not to predict the tails, but to survive long enough to be present when they arrive. Survival, avoiding ruin, is the first principle. If you can keep your chair at the table, compounding will eventually do most of the heavy lifting. Compounding is presented not as a formula, but as a personality trait masked as a math trick. The power of compounding is outrageously simple and simply outrageous. Most people do not believe it viscerally, because our minds are linear and the world of compounding is exponential. Housel points to how a small return, patiently allowed to breathe for decades, produces results that dwarf the clever tactics we obsess over. This vantage favors duration over brilliance. It suggests a paradox. The most important lever in wealth building is not a 2% better annual return, but the discipline to avoid behaviors that interrupt compounding. Investors rarely fail because they can't find higher returns. They fail because they refuse to endure normal volatility. They get bored, frightened, greedy, or competitive at the wrong moment, interrupting the engine. Thus, the behavior gap between what markets return and what investors actually earn is a psychological tax. The dividend of patience is real, but it is paid to people who can sit still through noise, headlines, and envy. From compounding, Housel moves to the idea of never enough. If your goals escalate with your income, you'll never feel rich no matter what you achieve. Social comparison is a treadmill without a finish line. There is always someone younger, more famous, or seemingly luckier, and if your happiness depends on outrunning them, you will never rest. The opposite of never enough is a clear, honest definition of enough. Enough says, past this level of income, the extra marginal utility of dollars is low and the potential cost to your time, peace, and integrity is high. Enough is not complacency, it is alignment. It lets you decline opportunities that would pay more but extract something priceless. It reframes money as fuel for freedom rather than a scoreboard to impress strangers. Without enough, risk-taking becomes distorted. People will leverage to the edge, cross ethical boundaries, or sacrifice relationships for marginal gains that don't increase well-being. Humility threads through the book. Because the world is dominated by tails, Even the greats cannot distinguish skill from luck with precision. Housel urges us to adopt policies that don't require us to be right about a specific narrative in order to succeed. Diversification, broad market investing, and a long time horizon are not signs of ignorance. They are acknowledgments of uncertainty. They are the portfolio equivalents of wearing a seatbelt, even if you are a careful driver. He distinguishes uncertainty from risk. Risk is an explicit probability distribution. Uncertainty is the fog of not knowing the distribution at all. In uncertainty, the main defense is room for error. Cash reserves, conservative debt levels, and expectations that are slightly underambitious. These cushions convert volatility from a mortal threat into a mere annoyance. Cash in his telling is not idle. Cash is an option. A form of oxygen that lets you hold your breath through panics and buy assets when others must sell. He tackles the man-in-the-car paradox, the idea that we buy status symbols hoping they will make others respect us. Yet observers admire the car, not the driver. The attention we crave doesn't land where we think it does. Respect, he suggests, is mostly earned by how you behave, not what you display. The practical extension is subtle and freeing. Seek admiration for your character, not your consumption. This reduces fragile, envy-driven spending. Purchases that drain financial resilience but deliver weak, short-lived social returns. When you consider money as a tool for control of your time, status consumption becomes less tempting. A luxury good that costs you freedom is not a luxury at all. The book also emphasizes that most financial planning is a bet on your future self. Your values will evolve. Your goals will flex. Because the future is a moving target, rigid long-term plans tend to break. The antidote is to aim for strategies that are durable across many possible futures. Maintain high savings rates, keep fixed costs low relative to income, avoid leverage that forces you to be exactly right, and choose investment vehicles that don't demand constant optimization. There is freedom in low expectations. If you plan for decent returns instead of heroic ones, you are less likely to be seduced into unnecessary risk and more likely to stay the course. Housel draws a pragmatic line between being rational and being reasonable with vivid examples. Consider a person who keeps a larger emergency fund than a spreadsheet would endorse. Strictly rational models might say the cash's expected return is low, therefore it is inefficient. But a reasonable assessment acknowledges the behavioral return. The person sleeps better, avoids high-interest debt when surprises happen, and resists panic selling in a downturn, protecting the compounding engine. The reasonable choice wins in the real world. Similarly, paying off a low-interest mortgage early might be mathematically suboptimal, but can be psychologically optimal if it reduces anxiety and increases the likelihood you'll stay invested elsewhere. Money serves your life, not the other way around. Luck and risk are presented as siblings, indistinguishable twins at a distance. Outcomes are not solely functions of effort or virtue. Bill Gates had talent and grit, but also happened to attend one of the few high schools with early access to a computer. Plenty of people work just as hard without those tailwind circumstances. This view is neither cynical nor defeatist. It is humane. It tempers our judgments of others, reduces arrogance in victory, and fosters resilience in defeat. If bad luck can strike good people, you should protect against it. If good luck graces your life, you should share the proceeds with gratitude. Viewing wealth through this lens makes you both more cautious and more generous. The text warns against the seduction of stories. Humans prefer clean narratives with protagonists, villains, and lessons. Markets, however, are messy ecosystems with millions of motives colliding. We introduce causal explanations after the fact because uncertainty is uncomfortable. The danger is that tidy stories make us overconfident. If we believe we understand why something happened, we may falsely believe we can predict the next turn. Better to treat narratives as hypotheses and anchor your behavior to principles that don't depend on a single story being true. For example, the reason the market rose last year is less useful than the principle that buying a broad, low-cost index and holding for years has historically captured the market's tail returns, and that sudden declines are common, normal, and survivable if you have a buffer. He discusses fees, not just literal fees paid to brokers or funds, but the fee of admission for superior returns, which is volatility and uncertainty. Many investors want the returns of equities without paying the fee of drawdowns. They exit at the sight of the bill. Housel's reframing is powerful. Volatility is not a fine for doing something wrong. It is a fee you must be willing to pay to access long-run growth. Once you accept this, down markets become less psychologically intolerable. You still feel them, but you don't personalize them as punishment. You see them as part of the contract. That mental shift encourages you to design your life so you can afford to pay the fee. By keeping expenses flexible, maintaining an emergency fund, and avoiding commitments that force you to sell at bad times. The book dwells on the subtlety that wealth is what you don't see. Flashy consumption is visible. Savings are invisible. Thus, we misread the world and confusedly copy those we think are wealthy because of what they display. But the person with the modest car and high savings rate likely has more freedom than the person with an expensive car and little cushion. True wealth is the gap between what you could buy and what you choose to buy. The gap is potential fuel for future opportunities and insurance against unknown threats. When you expand that gap, by raising income, lowering lifestyle inflation, or both, you increase your chances of living on your terms. In this spirit, Housel urges a high savings rate not as a sacrifice but as a strategy for optionality. Savings buy you flexibility, career pivots, sabbaticals, the ability to say no. They shorten the distance between you and choices that align with your values. Even without investing, a strong savings habit can transform your life. With investing, it becomes a wind at your back. Savings are also a social signal to yourself. They say you value future you as much as present you. That self-respect reduces never enough behaviors, because your goal is not to impress others, but to fund a life that fits you. He also speaks about reasonable optimism. Over long stretches, human progress compounds. The default trajectory is advancement in knowledge, productivity, and solutions to old problems. But progress is uneven. It arrives with setbacks and tragedies. Traders are often rewarded for pessimism in the short run because problems are concrete and immediate, while solutions are diffuse and delayed. The trick is to hold short-term pessimism. The knowledge that bad things happen and volatility is normal, within a long-term optimism that bets on compounding progress. This blend keeps you agile without becoming cynical, and patient without becoming naive. It lets you prepare for storms while investing for spring. A recurring theme is identity management. Avoid becoming wedded to one view or strategy, such that you can't change your mind. The strongest investors and savers cultivate a flexible identity. They can say, "I was wrong," without collapsing. That flexibility is a financial asset because the world changes. Tax laws evolve, technologies emerge, personal circumstances shift. We should build systems that allow for course correction without shame. One way is to have simple rules-based scripts for common decisions. Automate investments, rebalance on a schedule, keep a conservative cash buffer, so you're not reinventing everything under stress. Another is to keep your private definition of success foreground, so you're less tempted by trends that don't fit your needs. The text evaluates debt with nuance. Leverage magnifies outcomes, good or bad. In a world ruled by tails, this is perilous because tails arrive without warning. Debt narrows the margin of safety. It forces you to be right on schedule. For households, the guiding principle is to avoid debt structures that can trigger cascading failure. A manageable mortgage within conservative ratios can be sensible. High-interest revolving debt is a trap because its compounding works against you. Debt, like fire, requires respect. It can warm the house of your ambitions, but it can also burn it down. The safest path for most is to keep fixed obligations small relative to income, and to favor resilience over speed. Housel treats financial independence as the ultimate dividend. Independence is the ability to control your time, spend your days on work that matters to you, and remove the compulsion to obey capricious bosses or clients. Money buys this not by increasing pleasures but by removing sources of misery. Commutes you hate, schedules you cannot shape, obligations you cannot refuse. Once you taste even a small amount of autonomy, it calibrates your choices. The truly rich are not those with the most. They are those with enough, low needs, and durable freedom. Many of the book's recommendations, high savings, reasonable investing, humility about luck, are in service of this larger prize. He encourages an empirical attitude toward history. People often draw grand lessons from one era and apply them to another, but context changes. What worked in a particular market regime may not work in the next. The correct lesson is less X strategy always wins, and more avoid fragility, favor broad exposure to innovation, and stay in the game. The humility to admit that you don't know which sector, style, or country will dominate is a strength, not a weakness. History is a catalog of surprises. The future will add new chapters. Behavioral pitfalls receive close attention. Overconfidence leads to concentrated bets without appreciation for tails. Recency bias causes us to expect the recent past to persist, making booms look eternal and busts look terminal. Loss aversion makes losses loom larger than gains, tempting us to sell precisely when expected returns improve. The antidotes are mundane but mighty. Automation to bypass willpower. Checklists that ask, what if I'm wrong? Buddies or advisors to provide emotional ballast, and default settings that keep you invested. A good plan that you can stick with beats a perfect plan you abandon. There are quiet philosophical notes about generosity and stewardship. When you see your success as partly luck, you find it easier to share. Giving becomes not a performance but a natural response to the truth that we all ride networks of support. Teachers, mentors, colleagues, infrastructure built by others. The goal is not asceticism but proportion. Spend on things that genuinely raise your well-being, health, relationships, time, and save aggressively on things that don't. Money used to repair or prevent regrets is well spent. Money used to impress passers-by is often wasted. He returns often to the importance of expectations. Wealth is relative to expectations. If your expectations rise faster than your income, you feel poor. If your expectations rise slowly, you may feel content even at modest levels. Managing expectations is thus a financial skill. It involves conscious comparison. Choosing reference groups that don't inflame envy, curating your information diet to mute status anxiety, and periodically revisiting your definition of enough. The practical effect is powerful. If you can be happy with a simpler lifestyle, your savings rate climbs, your need to take risky bets falls, and your tolerance for volatility rises because your basic life is funded. The book's portraits of investors and families underline these points. The janitor who saved diligently and invested quietly ends life wealthy, while the high-earning professional with lavish habits and leverage ends in financial stress. The contrast is not about intelligence, it is about behavior and time. The janitor wasn't optimizing factor tilts, he was respecting compounding. Meanwhile, the professional was optimizing for appearances, and appearances are an expensive hobby. The parable lands with force because it's common. You have far more control over your savings rate and behavior than you do over market returns, tax regimes, or macroeconomic tides. Focus on the levers you can pull. Another recurring principle is the virtue of simplicity. Complexity is seductive, it feels sophisticated. But complex strategies often have more points of failure and are harder to stick with when stress rises. Simple portfolios, broad index funds, automatic contributions, occasional rebalancing, are robust. They won't win every year. They'll look unfashionable when a niche style is hot. But they reduce the behavioral tax because they're easy to understand and maintain. Simplicity is also respectful of your finite attention. It leaves you time to invest in relationships, skills, and health. The true compounding engines behind your ability to earn and enjoy life. Near the end, Housel suggests that the true goal is to align your financial behavior with the kind of person you want to be. Money is a mirror. If you value kindness, build a plan that enables generous giving without compromising resilience. If you value exploration, build a plan that funds sabbaticals. If you value family, optimize for time over toys. Money cannot deliver meaning, but it can scaffold it. The emotions we experience around money, fear, greed, pride, envy, are clues to what we believe. Working with those emotions, rather than pretending to be purely rational, gives your plan staying power. The book's grand lesson can be distilled into an attitude. Be humble about what you know, skeptical of stories, respectful of luck, obsessive about survival, and patient with compounding. Save more than seems necessary. Spend less time comparing. Keep a simple portfolio you'll hold through storms. Carry cash as a cushion and an option. Avoid leverage that can force you to the exits. Define enough in writing. And remember that true wealth is the freedom to control your time. These principles are deliberately boring, and they are precisely what make them durable. Ultimately, the psychology of money tells us that the most important battles in finance are fought inside, not out there in the markets. If you can tame the itch to chase, brace against the panic to sell, and avoid upgrading your lifestyle to match every raise, you will enter the minority who not only accumulate wealth but keep it. And if you can find contentment in enough, you will enjoy what money cannot directly buy. A life aligned with your values, rich in autonomy, generous in spirit, and calm in its seasons. The math of money matters, but the story you live with your money matters more. If you choose a story of patience, prudence, and purpose, time becomes your greatest ally, and the quiet feeling in your chest, the freedom to choose, becomes your truest dividend.